All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Zulfikar, or Muhammad Zulfikar Ahmad. I'm from the China-Indonesia Studies at the Center of Economic and Law Studies in Jakarta, where we focus on examining the relationship between China and Indonesia. And today we are going to present one of our ongoing research on the Chinese Muslim diplomacy towards Indonesia. And our presentation is divided into two segments. The first segment, my colleague will present on why China is important for Indonesia, and then I will then present on the concept of Muslim diplomacy and how China implements Muslim diplomacy in Indonesia. Without further ado, I will invite my colleague Yeta Purnama, who will present why China is important for Indonesia.
Okay, thank you, Muhammad, and it is my pleasure. And good afternoon, everyone. As Muhammad mentioned, I will be providing the context of our topic, which is why China is important to Indonesia. And yeah, this day, China is a very important country to Indonesia since the Jokowi administration. Diplomatic relations between the two countries have grown significantly. China is a potential partner in Jokowi's economic agenda. The close relationship between the two countries is motivated by two main sectors, namely trade and investment. And yeah, the value of trade has been robust since the Jokowi era in 2015 till now. It has significantly increased since 2019 with an amount of $79 billion and $149 billion in 2022. Meanwhile, in the investment sector, China is Indonesia's second largest investment. China is second only to Singapore with an investment value of $3.8 billion by mid-2023. And interestingly, many say that China is actually Indonesia's #1 largest investor because basically many companies in Singapore are owned by Chinese firms who also invest in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Okay. It's not surprising that the two countries are taking advantage of this cooperation opportunity because Indonesia itself is actually an important country for China, especially in its Belt and Road Initiative agenda. If you look at this map, there are two roads of the BRI. The first is the land road, which is colored blue, and the second is the maritime road, which colored red. It can be seen that Indonesia is one of the countries in Southeast Asia that is included in the BRI maritime route. We therefore argue that Indonesia is considered crucial in the realization of the BRI. Next, please. Okay. Here are some of the BRI's projects in Indonesia. These projects range from transport, tourism, energy, urban, and nickel industry. The nickel refining project is the largest project in Indonesia, followed by tourism and energy projects. Next, please. Okay. Furthermore, during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was also accompanied by a significant increase in cooperation between the two countries. There are three significant sectors of cooperation. First, in the health industry. China is the largest supplier of medical equipment to Indonesia during the period from May 3 to July 3, 2021, with a value of $8 million or 25% of Indonesia's total import of medical equipment. Sinopec and Sinopharm have exported vaccines to Indonesia in 16 batches with details of 6.4 million ready-to-use vaccines and 115.5 million semi-finished vaccines. Please. Okay. Besides that, the two countries also cooperate for currency exchange. China and Indonesia signed an agreement to promote the use of yuan and rupiah for bilateral trade and investment. Bank Indonesia reported the technical requirements related of the local currency settlement between Beijing and Jakarta have been completed. The cooperation also aims to increase the use of local currency and reduce dependence on US dollar. Okay. And the last one is the cooperation in the defense sector. Indonesia Ministry of Defense has very close tie with China's Minister of Defense. The two countries have established joint military exercise and the 2+2 dialogue focusing on defense cooperations. Overall, the ties between China and Indonesia are quite strong. Some even argue that Indonesia is now heavily dependent on China economically. While the economic aspect of the BRI in Indonesia has been discussed widely, what is less known is the implementation of the BRI in Indonesia also involves promoting positive narratives on China, especially among Muslim communities in Indonesia. And this will be explored further by my colleague Muhammad. Thank you.
Next slide, please. All right. Despite the growing relationship, the image of China in Indonesia has been declining. One of the reasons is the historical anti-China sentiment exists in Indonesia since 1965, with the communist issue in Indonesia back then. With I think the sentiment still lingers until today. However, the sentiment has increased recently, especially with the environmental and labor impact of Chinese investment, as well as the COVID-19, where a lot of Indonesians believe that COVID-19 is actually originated from Indonesia, from China, I mean. However, with all of this situation, I think China has attempted to try to spread its positive narratives in Indonesia, because one of the reasons why there is a declining image of China in Indonesia is due to the Xinjiang issue, right? There have been a lot of protests and demonstrations being organized in Indonesia, mainly taking place in front of the Chinese embassy in Jakarta. And in response to this, China has established or has implemented what we call to be the Muslim diplomacy. Yes, next slide, please. Next. All right, so we developed the concept of Muslim diplomacy from a scholarship on Chinese studies, especially when it comes to faith diplomacy. Some call it faith diplomacy, some call it religious diplomacy. However, the most common one is faith diplomacy, whereby many have discussed how China has used some kind of religious tools aimed or directed towards religious communities. Some have spoken about Christian diplomacy, Buddhist diplomacy, and Hindu diplomacy. And very interestingly, in the context of Indonesia, China has adopted what we call to be the Muslim diplomacy. And the Muslim diplomacy has not been developed very much in the existing literature. Next. Next. All right, so faith diplomacy is mainly about the use of any religion-related tools or platform to achieve a country's interests. All right, next. And when we develop the Muslim diplomacy, the concept of Muslim diplomacy in Indonesia, the objectives are threefold. The first one is to create a positive image of China among Muslims in Indonesia. Number two is to garner legitimacy of China's religious policies, especially towards the Uyghur. And the third one is to legitimize China's political and economic interests in the country. Next. All right. So what are the form of China's Muslim diplomacy? The first form is China has tried to establish close relationship with Muslim organization in Indonesia. In Indonesia, there are two main Muslim organizations. Number one is Muhammadiyah and number two is Nahdlatul Ulama. This organization, a lot of scholars have written about it, play a very important role in the Indonesian political system. All right? So they have a big sway in the political system and the domestic political landscape. And I think China understands this context and has attempted to establish cooperation with Indonesia, with this organization. And the relationship have taken place mainly, I'm sure you have heard that China often invites journalists to the so-called Xinjiang trip to China. Actually, in this particular trip, when it comes specifically to Indonesia, China has actually invited Muslim scholars from Indonesia to participate in this particular trip. And upon the return, they will be required to deliver sermons, especially in the Friday prayers and in the, like religious gathering or religious circle, to speak, that nothing happened in Xinjiang, Islam in China is very peaceful, and so on and so forth. That's what happened. The second thing is that there is also money involved, where they provide funding to pesantren. Pesantren is an Islamic boarding school, Islamic educational institution, and other social activities. And this has taken place through the Chinese embassy in Jakarta. So one of our findings, we went to one of the Islamic boarding schools during the month of Ramadan last year, where we visited during the event of breaking the fast. And that particular breaking the fast was actually funded by the Chinese embassy, where some of the Chinese embassy staff were present during that particular event. And, as you can assume that during the event, one of the talks that were delivered was about, the Xinjiang issue, that nothing happened in Xinjiang, Xinjiang is a Western propaganda, and so on and so forth. And after the event, we actually interviewed the head of the school, who is very well-known Islamic scholar in Indonesia. So we asked him about the event, and he proudly says that it is funded by the Chinese embassy, that they had a very close relationship since 2018. And one of the reasons that he gave was, of course, what I call to be the Cold War mentality. Oh, China is an alternative to the Western hypocrisy, and so on and so forth. That's one of the reasons that they give. And the second form is that providing scholarship to Muslim students. In Indonesia, we call it santris. So actually, China, since 2018, has tried to attract Muslim students specifically for scholarship. And how do they do that? So they're not only like holding some kind of academic exhibition usually it takes place in the hotels, but this kind of academic exhibition actually taking place in the mosque. So in one of the largest mosques in Java Island, in Indonesia, they actually had a study in China, like academic exhibition, where they invite students to study in China, and then, what do we call it? And it was actually held in the mosque, all right? And these students have now returned to Indonesia. I'm going to talk about the impact later on, but many of these students have now returned to Indonesia, and now they appear on many television where they speak some kind of pro-China narrative on television. Next. And then another important form is media diplomacy. I'm sure they have heard about this, where they recruit local journalists, and then they also engage in a social media diplomacy, where they hired the so-called social media influencers to actually speak about Islam in China, and then inviting Indonesian journalists to China, and then signing content agreement with Indonesian media. All of this media involvement are mainly focusing on two aspects. Number one is that the Xinjiang issue, that is a Western propaganda. The second one is that about the Belt and Road Initiative, that the BRI is benefiting Indonesia. But what we are focusing this time is on the Xinjiang issue. Next. And next. And then several Chinese media have also established their branch offices in Indonesia, like Xinhua and Hai Indo Channel, which is owned by the China International Television Corporation. And they have also a social media account, especially Twitter in Bahasa Indonesia, in Indonesian language, where they have a huge number of followers. I think today around 70 or 80,000 followers, where they use all of these accounts to kind of propagate positive narratives about China. Next. And then, yeah, this is just one of the examples how Xinhua Indonesian Twitter feeds often contain like translated Xi Jinping speeches narratives on how the BRI would benefit Indonesia, and then news on the visit of an Indonesian politician to Xinjiang, often also talk about Taiwan's unification with China, the one China policy, and then the positive comments that she made about Xinjiang, and so on and so forth. Next. And then another form is inviting journalists to China. And then this is very interesting that one of the largest media in Indonesia, one of the English language media in Indonesia called the Jakarta Post, we did an interview with them that one of the directors mentioned that all of the Jakarta Post journalists have actually been to China. And now it is part of their requirement. So in order for them to continue working in Jakarta Post, they have or they must have been able or have been to China. So they must participate in the trip or the journalist trip to China. And then another interesting thing is that when it comes to the journalists participating in this so-called trip to Xinjiang, upon their return they will be required to write news stories about Xinjiang, news story about Islam in China. One of the journalists from one of the newspapers called Republika, which is one of the widely read newspapers in Indonesia, actually did not write something positive about the visit. So what happened to him is that after the article was published, he received a WhatsApp message from Chinese embassy in Jakarta telling him to take down the article. So this kind of intimidation is also taking place among journalists who have been to China. And we have to understand that even the Indonesian Journalists Association have very strong relationship with the Belt and Road Initiative Journalist Forum. Next. And next. Okay, and then there is some evidence also that, as I mentioned earlier, that the Chinese state has sought to intimidate Indonesian journalists. As I mentioned, they often receive WhatsApp message from the Chinese embassy employee telling them to take down the article. Next. And then another thing is social media engagement, and this has often been done by the Chinese ambassador to ASEAN, who is based in Jakarta, and he has a Twitter account in Indonesian language where he often spread positive narratives about Xinjiang. Next. And then also, Lu Kang is one of the, I think, the first Chinese ambassador to Indonesia who actually opened a Twitter account right after he was inaugurated in early 2022, and now he has a huge number of followers. Next. And then, next. All right, and then another important form is that in fighting social media influencers to China, and this is one of the two participants, the former Miss Indonesia, and after she visited China in 2019, she posted a photo, which is now deleted, of a mosque outside Beijing, and telling her followers to that China welcomes every religion. And then one of the research from Tenggara Statistics mentioned that this influencer were paid $500 per diem and were not subject to offer censorship. So this kind of engagement are still ongoing until today. Next. And then the last form is cooperating with Indonesian parties, including the Muslim or the Islamic-based parties. So, and this mostly focusing on party management and caderization. And many of the parties in Indonesia they all have traveled to China, and they receive also funding from Beijing. Next. All right. So what are the implications of this Muslim diplomacy? Of course, the biggest implication is that in October 2022, when the United Nations was debating whether they should discuss about Xinjiang issue or not, Indonesia was one of the countries who voted no, alongside other Muslim countries in the world. And a number of Muslim figures and scholars are now voicing Chinese narratives, like there is no discrimination in Xinjiang. And students who have studied in China are now appearing in local media. This is one of the examples, and this has a lot of number of viewers in Indonesia. Next. All right, and this is one of the research that has been done where the members of one of the Muslim organizations in Indonesia based in China, and the research was focusing on how they interact in social media, and we found that their interaction in Indonesia, their interaction on social media attempt to avoid any negative criticism towards China. Next. And this is also another important study that found that Indonesian media that have cooperated with Chinese media are now avoiding contents that are critical of China. So in a way, the Chinese Muslim diplomacy that China have been trying to implement in Indonesia since 2011 2018 or 2017 have actually worked or have actually bring some impacts on the people in Indonesia. Next, thank you very much. If you have any question, feel free to ask. Okay.
Mohammed, thank you so much for your presentation. I read your work, and I thank you for the only person who actually does this work in Indonesia, at least in English. My name is Maya Wang, and I'm from Human Rights Watch. I feel like I personally lived through what you just described because I visited Indonesia in 2018, advocating for to try to get the Indonesian government to do the right things on Xinjiang, on Uyghurs. And everywhere I went, literally people were telling me excitedly that they have been invited to China to study. It was journalists, it was the Muhammadiyah, the two organizations in the lobby. You have these young rising stars that say that I'm going to China, and so on and so forth. I was really shocked because of just how whole government, like, it seems like the amount of resources the Chinese government piled on in Indonesia was so great that, first of all, my question is, why is the Indonesian government allows this? I mean, okay, I see there is money involved, but on the other hand, it's so obvious, it's so intentional. The Indonesian government is going into bed with the Chinese government in such an uncritical way. In the rest of Southeast Asia, you've got like countries like Singapore, which, as I understand, is much more critical of balancing China and the US. So I think my question is, like, why is that way? Is the Indonesian government willingly being influenced by the Chinese government?
Right. I think the current government of Jokowi has been very reliant on China, and especially for its economic agenda. So I think one of the good example is the recently completed the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway, which was initially developed by Japan, and then later on it was turned over by China. And one of the reasons is because China provides the speedy development of that. I think the current government really likes to inaugurate something, inaugurate infrastructure, inaugurate new facilities, and China provides that. So that's why the current government is very close with China. That's why they have not been very critical of China when it comes to Xinjiang issue, with the South China Sea issue. In fact, with the Taiwan issue last year, when the incident happened between China and Taiwan, the government in Indonesia also said that we stick to one China policy. So I think even though this plays a major role, I think money still plays the big portion of that. All right, I think time is up. So many questions. So we're not allowed, right? All right, one more. Anyone is fine. I think the gentleman right here. Right.
Sure, thank you. I'll try and keep mine brief. My name is Inigo Alexander. I'm a journalist with the Andres Bello Foundation based in Colombia. I was just interested in the fact that you pointed out about how China invites a lot of Muslim religious leaders to Xinjiang, and as our colleague just pointed out, a lot of them proudly participate and they're happy to reflect their participation in such programs. But I was wondering how the participation by religious leaders in these sort of events is taken within the Muslim community itself and everyday believers. Is it something that they also take pride in, or is it something that they're able to distinguish the double standards in and then question themselves?
So I think when it comes to Indonesian society, we have to understand that not everyone is well educated, especially with the global issues. Many of them have no idea what's going on in other parts of the world, and in many parts of Indonesia, a lot of people are really blindly following their imams, like the religious leaders. So whatever the religious leaders say, they just say yes, And this is the scary thing, because the critical aspect of the understanding is gone, because they don't know what to do. They don't have any other alternative. So But when it comes to students, or you're talking about activists and other educated segment of the society, I think some they understand that there is some kind of double standard in this matter, but when it comes to the common layman in Indonesia, they do know the difference between right or wrong, which one is correct and which one is not. That is the scary thing. And one of the funny things is that in one of the villages that we visited, and this particular, and in Indonesia usually we can actually divide the villages like dominated by one Muslim organization, like Muhammadiyah dominated or Nahdlatul Ulama dominated. And one of the villages that we visited, actually in every prayer, 5 times a day, they pray for, no. One of the interesting things is that I went to one of the Salafi movement. Like the Salafi is the one from Saudi Arabia, and which is very big in Indonesia nowadays. And one of the tenets is that you're not allowed to criticize the government. Similar to what happened in Saudi Arabia, right? You're not allowed to criticize the king. So actually, one of my friends who adherents of Salafi movements, they're actually telling me that I'm not allowed to criticize Xi Jinping, which is quite funny. I don't know why. So he tells me like criticizing Xi Jinping is haram. And I was like, but that happened. We're not allowed to criticize the government. I was like, okay. But, it exists. Something like that. But, and yeah, I think depends on who you talk to. If you talk to educated people, I think they know the differences. But common layman people, I don't think so. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.